there may be some background noise that comes out from your side, and that might interfere with the speaker's talk. So if you can, please try to keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question or something. We're also happy for questions for the speaker. We usually reserve those for the end. We used to use the Zoom chat, but for today, we're going to try using Slido. I'll drop a link to the Slido platform after I've done the introduction, where you can drop questions as you're going, as the talk is going, and then we'll just look at those questions at the end and ask the speaker. And finally, feel free to drop off the call if you need to. We do understand some pressing stuff can come up wherever you are. While we'd love to have you on the call for the whole meetup, you should feel free to drop off if you need to. And then just to say thank you to our sponsors, so for supporting our community and yeah, just helping us host events like this, and especially our in-person events where we actually need more resources. So Peach Payments is one of our sponsors. They've been with us since the early days when we started doing sponsorships. If you want to check out what Peach Payment does, you can go to peachpayments.com and you can see if that's something that may be interesting for you or your company. We also have OfferZen as our sponsors. They do our swag, which I'll talk about in a bit. And if you've been here before, you know about it already. But yes, as usual, thank you to OfferZen for their support for our community. And in more exciting news, we have a new sponsor we've recently started working with, starting this month. So that's Root. Rootplatform.com is their website, and Root is a platform for modern insurance designed around data, flexibility, and control. It allows for end-to-end data insurance, a digital insurance that streamlines product launches and digital engagement. So yeah, very excited to have Root joining us as our new sponsors, and also just check them out at rootplatform.com. And then a couple of things from the tech leadership side. We have a monthly tech leadership newsletter that is got curated engineering leadership content that we've found that will help you to learn and grow yourself as an engineering leader. We send that out once a month, right after the meetup. So one will be going out at 8 p.m. today. You can sign up on the URL below there. If you've got your phone with you, you can quickly scan the QR code, but I'll also be sharing the link to this right after I've done the introduction, and you can drop an email if you want to join that. We're also on Twitter, where we are more active, and we share these links almost daily on engineering leadership content. So if you are on Twitter and you're looking for a bit of a more frequent pulse around this engineering leadership content, you can follow us at Tech Leadership X. And then I mentioned the OfferZen swag as our sponsor. OfferZen gives swag to people who attend our meetup. I'll be sharing a link to a type form. If you are residing in South Africa and you fill in that type form, you may, or should I say, you're likely to get swag from OfferZen in the next few days. So that's an awesome form. You should just have a look at it and fill it in. And again, I'll share the link. I'll just drop a whole bunch of links right after this. And then to our speaker of the day, I am just going to move to our tech leadership site and get a nice pic of Mark there. Very popular speaker, as you heard him already speaking to other people in the introduction, so knows a lot of people. I realized I've known Mark since 2011, so it's been a while now. Our careers crossed over at Allan Gray for a couple of years, and a lot of his work there was influential in my own career and in the way I approach my life in my early days. So big fan of Mark. We've stayed in touch and worked on a few other things together since then, so we've kept in contact. Mark has been a tech leadership speaker before in our early days. That event was actually hosted at Allan Gray, and it was an in-person event. So we're excited to have him back, sharing his great knowledge with us. And today's talk is going to be about networking, like your life depends on it in a disconnected world. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Mark Orpen.
Well, thanks very much, Tanaka, for that welcome, and welcome to all of you here in today's forum. I hope this is not the last time that we get to connect and to chat about important topics that bind us all together. I'm going to just put the screen up here, and sorry, let's quick that up. And as Tanaka said, this topic is around networking like your life depends on it. And it might seem a little bit overly dramatic when you hear a header like that starting off this topic. But you'll see a little bit later on, I'll make the case for why networking is so important, not just from a business perspective, but also from your personal life perspective. And I think we are becoming, ironically, more disconnected in this world where we're always on and we've got all these beautiful technical advances, etc. And so how do we build these networks? Because the pandemic certainly has shown a couple of curveballs. There's some interesting research that I'll share with you around what that's done to our networking capabilities. And then what I'd like to do, use the power of this network here in this group to actually explore how we can creatively develop our networks going forward. So not just me talking at you, but me talking with you and exploring this fascinating topic. So just in terms of this actual definition of networking, I think it's quite important for us to have this very similar understanding, because I think most of us, when we think about networking, it's almost similar to like when we talk about politics, there's a dirty connotation, it's manipulative, it's brown nosing, it's you using people, etc., etc. And that's not the way that I see networking at all. I think, to my mind, there's three key parts of this definition that I just want to briefly unpack. And the first one's about building and maintaining mutually beneficial connections. And so often we get very caught up on, well, how do we expand our networks? How do we grow our networks? But we've also got to make sure that we maintain those. And I remember having a fascinating conversation with a lady in an investment company. She'd been in the company for 15 years. She was in her early 50s. And she said, I'm incredibly lonely. And I realized that I have no power. And I asked her, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, initially when I was in an organization, I really made a concerted effort to get to know people and build friendships, etc. And then I thought I had my network. And then what transpired over a period of time was that people left, as they typically do, and she didn't leave, and she didn't keep on replenishing her network channels inside the organization. So she became less and less influential and more isolated. And she had this realization in her early 50s that she had to reinvest in it. So it's about not just about building, it's also about maintaining those relationships. And the key thing here is about mutually beneficial. This is not, and throughout this, the underlying message of this today's session should be around how do we add value to other people and they add value back. It's not just us taking and sponging. People don't like to be used. They know when they're being used and they don't appreciate it. So how do we add value to other people? And then ultimately for shared positive outcomes. And that kind of leads me to a very important part of this conversation. And that's really around, well, what is your objective when it comes to networking? Because I think often when we think about networks, we think about them as just sort of this amorphous, huge whole of connections. But actually, there are many subtle variations that come in from a networking perspective. And I'll get to that a little bit later in terms of the different kinds of networks that exist. But if we start with the question of, well, why are we networking? I'd like to ask the group, why do people network? What's the underlying reason why we network? And so this is an open question. I'd like to hear people just respond and hear your perspectives.
I think, especially it's Benny, by the way. I think one of the reasons it's really great to network is just to learn from other folks in your industry about what they're doing and take some professional, I suppose, experience from them too.
Okay, so that opportunity to learn, to grow, potentially to collaborate, I suppose, if you've got overlapping interests and things like that. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great component. David, yeah.
Two things that stand out for me. One, just meeting a need for connection, like actually connecting with people and keeping on connecting. And then I think it was an old Yahoo term about manufacturing serendipity. Like the more things we can see, the more serendipity can enter our world. So
Yeah, it's two lovely points you're raising there, and I think inherently as human beings, we are tribal by nature. We want to be part of a group. We want to connect. It's part of our evolutionary psychology makeup. And so we have that deep need to belong and be part of something. So that connection is hugely important. And then that point that you were making around serendipity, a lot of, when you think about innovation and creativity, if you understand what your constraints are and you know what you're interested in, it's amazing how suddenly the connections between people or ideas start working. But if you don't have that understanding of what it is that you are trying to be creative or innovative about, it's very hard to create that serendipity. So both of those points kind of feed very, very nicely into the theme of today's workshop. Anybody else? What other reasons would we have for networking?
Yeah, I'll add mine. I think networks are a useful way to evaluate things without doing the work. So if because people that think someone is credible and they have an opinion about something, you can instantly calibrate what that is. Is it good? Is it bad? It's how you do like research in other companies, because you can't do the hundreds of hours of work.
Okay. So you're leveraging the wisdom of others to get an insight into furthering your own knowledge. Okay, yeah, I totally get that. Thanks, Stefan. Anything else? Any other reasons why we network?
Couldn't it be just to build relationships with people?
Sorry, Cheyenne, I think you can go, and then Ewan, I think you were going to say something. So Cheyenne, go first.
Yeah, increasing diversity of opinion.
Mm-hmm. And why is that important?
I think when you're at a company for a while, sometimes you descend into a bit of groupthink, and you do need like that combo breaker to just get you out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Procter & Gamble did that very nicely where they pushed towards getting more than 50% of their creative ideas from external to the organization. And with that, they obviously they boosted their own sort of creativity and products, quickness to market, etc. And like you say, also that drinking your own Kool-Aid, you end up with groupthink. Just that diversity kind of really helps from that perspective. Cool, nice. Ewan, I think you were wanting to say something.
Yeah, I was saying just to build relationships with people.
And why would that be important?
Well, for me, it's just bad examples. My cameras off. Put a face to the name. So if you know people, you can work better with them. Okay. I find if I see and interact with people in a semi-social setting, it's easier to work with them professionally.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when there's that relationship, the psychological safety, the willingness to attach your name to their name, because everybody's a brand, all of those kind of help foster better working relationships. And there's a lot of research actually about effective teams, and what they say is if you're doing cross-functional teams where you've got between 20 and 40% of the people in the team who've actually worked together before, you are more likely to have a high performance outcome than when you've got zero connection. So having that existing relationship is helpful from that sort of perspective, and also just from an honesty, trust perspective, etc., etc. Cool. Okay, I love what you guys are coming up with, and I think it marries quite nicely with what I'm going to be sharing with you here. And the first one really talks to what David Campion was saying around connection, and ultimately it feeds a sense of belonging. As I said before, as human beings, and from an evolutionary psychology perspective, we were geared that way. Even from a neuroscience perspective, this whole idea with oxytocin that gets secreted when we connect with each other, and that allows us to bond at a deeper level. It's something that we crave as human beings. Interestingly, there was a piece of research that was done by a lady called Julian Lund-Holstadt, who was looking at what are the factors that drive premature death, and what are the things that you need to be aware of. And typically, if I did a little round robin here with all of you and asked you what are those factors, we'd say things like, well, don't drink too much, don't smoke, exercise, don't be obese, watch your blood pressure, all the things we kind of know. And in her study of 148 studies, 300,000 people, this meta study that she conducted, the number 2 factor that determined whether people were going to die prematurely or not was the strength of their social connections. And so people who didn't have strong social connections were 50% more likely to die prematurely than people who had strong social connections. And in fact, they took it to the extreme where they looked at people in the top 10th percentile versus people in the bottom 10th percentile. And they found that it was the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So I said earlier on, like your life depends on it. And that was not hyperbole. It actually is born out of scientific research. We do need these networks, these connections, just from a life-giving perspective. Then the second thing is, and which somebody mentioned earlier on, I think you were also talking a little bit about it, was around growth and the sense of progress, because a lot of the growth that we experience is, especially if we're a newbie early in our lives, we've got a lot of theory and we've got all the richness of our university experience, but we don't have any of the pragmatic, practical experiences. And the fusing of the newbie with the new thinking and the person who's maybe been around the block is often where a lot of that magic happens. And interestingly, one of the big challenges from the pandemic and the groups of people that have been most impacted by this, the lack of networking opportunities has been the newbies into organizations. And they're actually much more, interesting enough, the younger generation, the Gen Zs and etc., are more inclined to want to come into the offices, ironically, because they want to get that mentorship, that access to networks, etc., which I think a lot of us almost take for granted because we built those networks up over a period of time. But it feeds ultimately that sense of progress. So that's the second reason. The third reason why we connect is very much around innovation, and where we get lots of different people sharing different ideas, different interests, different skill sets. And a lot of the problems that we're facing nowadays are wicked in the sense of their complexity. And so it's unusual for one person to be able to solve something all by themselves. We're finding that interdisciplinary teams are having much more impact. In fact, there's been interesting research on from a science perspective where they look at research papers that get quoted a lot, and the size of the people of the authoring teams of these research papers has almost doubled, and kind of acknowledging that, from an innovation perspective, we need to have networks around us. And then the last one, which actually nobody really mentioned, and maybe it's because I suppose it jars a little bit with the definition that I provided up front around networking, is this idea around power. And this is where, I'm not going to be pushing the agenda of being a Machiavellian puppet master, and that's why we should be networking. But I do notice in organizations that sometimes there are some very brilliant people who have got great ideas, and they're just, for some reason, their ideas get no traction. And then there are other people who are well connected and are able to figure out who are those informal and formal gatekeepers, and then be able to build that lobbying and that support so that they can get their ideas across the line. And so power can be one of the reasons why we network as well. And just on this last one, again, because often people have a negative connotation when it comes to politics and power, etc., there's a reality that there's always going to be limited resources in any organization. There's always going to be interdependencies, and there's always going to be different perspectives. And so if we don't have networks where we have people who've got our back, it's going to be very difficult for us to get traction often on some of the things that we feel are important for the organization. So let me move on from why we network to what's actually happening to our network. So I read a recent article that was done by Marissa King from Yale School of Management, and it was interesting. They did studies where they did pre and post the pandemic and looking at what's happened to our network sizes. And what she's found is that on average, our work and our personal networks have declined by 16% in terms of the numbers in our networks. Now, you've got to be careful, I suppose, around breadth and depth, because it's not just a numbers game in the sense of broad networks are always going to be beneficial for you. If you don't have a meaningful relationship with an individual, it can also not always translate into something that's going to be a positive, mutually beneficial outcome. But it is interesting that it has declined so significantly. And then when you scratch down into the data and you look at actually what's happening, it's even more alarming and predominantly this audience is male, just judging by the names that I saw when we started talking, that the social network has declined by 50% for males. For women, it's almost negligible in terms of the decline in the networks. But for men, it has declined by 30%. And they were hypothesizing, why is that? And why did the pandemic have such a negative impact on people's networks? And what they said was that men typically don't talk about stuff when they're in their networks. They do stuff. So you'll go for a cycle with somebody, you'll drink a beer, or you'll watch sport, or whatever it might be. Whereas women will typically be, and this is not me being stereotypical, this is what the researchers who happen to be females were saying, was they were saying that they talk about their feelings and their challenges and how they're going to overcome them, etc. And that didn't get impacted on by the pandemic because there wasn't so they could do this over a Zoom chat and they could maintain their networks. Whereas men were limited in terms of what they typically used to do to build their networks. They didn't have access to. Now, obviously, we've moved out of the pandemic and isolation, but it'll be interesting to see how these things rebound, or if we stay reclusive, or kind of that 16%, or sorry, for men, 30% gets locked into our social networks. So the reality check that I want to ask you to think a little bit about is, how strong is your networks? And here this is a conversation about breadth and depth. And there's to my mind, there's sort of 6, you probably could slice and dice it many other ways, but I think there's 6 broad categories that you need to be thinking about when it comes to networks. And I'll start right at the top at 12 o'clock on the information connection hexagon, and then I'll move around clockwise, just explaining each of those. So the information connections one is around knowing people that have got their finger on the pulse, the cutting edge, they're most up to date with what's going on in the industry, etc. They're your go-to people. They're the ones that are on the inside who really know what's going on and have got really valuable information. Things that maybe not even appearing in the textbooks or the magazines. They're really on that frontier. So that's the first one. The political support and influence kind of speaks for itself, but it talks to who are the gatekeepers, who are the people who you need to get on your side. And sometimes it can be formal, in terms of organizational hierarchy, but sometimes it's informal. I remember one of the funniest experiences I had as a young sort of HR professional. I was working at a very large insurance organization, and each of the directors had their own secretaries back in those days. And typically, a lot of my peers were treated the secretaries in quite a dismissive kind of way. You're more junior than us, blah, blah, blah. And I made it a point of departure to really get very invested in what their interests were and what they were wanting to do in their own careers, etc. And the funny thing was, I was always able to book an appointment in any of the directors' diaries, almost at the drop of a hat, because I built up that personal rapport with those people that actually are theoretically were low down in the pecking order, but actually had immense power because they're the ones who were managing the diary. So don't always just look at your organigram, also look at who are the people that are power brokers to a degree. Then the third one, the negative one, is not one that you actually actively want to develop, but the reality of ever being in a corporate environment is that you are going to irritate some people, and there are people who just maybe have got a different agenda to you or got a different worldview to you, and you need to know who those people are that are actively against what you are proposing and what you stand for. And then once you understand who those people are, it's to then say, okay, so how do I deal with those individuals? Do I try and win them over? Do I ignore them? Do I go through them? Do I go over them? What is my strategy? Because, and sometimes you can't ignore them. You have to have quite a proactive sort of strategy around that. But you need to appreciate who those individuals are. Then at 6 o'clock, at the bottom of professional growth, it's those people that are mentors and coaches that are growing you. And I think it's a bit of a misnomer that we often fall into the trap is as we become more experienced and senior, that we are above that. And I've seen this reverse mentoring can be incredibly powerful. I was mentoring a young Muslim lady who was in 3rd year as an engineering student at UCT. And she was like off the charts smart. I mean, she was so creative, so entrepreneurial. And here I was meant to be mentoring her. And I can guarantee you, I learned a lot more from her than what she ever learned from me. And so reverse mentoring can be a very, very powerful thing. But also just finding other people who are going to mentor and coach and grow us through the course of our lives, finding people that are diverse, that are different to us, but that we respect. I don't find Personally, I don't find that mentoring programs that are top down from organizations where they choose who you mentor with works. I've tried that in all corporates, and it's a recipe for failure. There has to be a chemistry. You have to respect that person. So it's always better when it's bottom up, when you drive it yourself from that perspective. And then the professional support and energy is those people typically inside your organization who have an understanding of the climate, the challenges, the key characters in the system that you can lean on, that you can actually, if you're having a tough day at work, you can go and you can just, they're there, they understand the context and they can give you good advice or just be a shoulder to lean on. And then the balanced one is people typically outside, although you can have crossovers inside the business as well, of people who feed a different part of your soul. So maybe you're part of a mountain biking club or a reading or book club or whatever, or something that you're just really interested in, that's a shared interest, whatever that happens to be. And they create that other space for you. So as you can see, there's nuances in terms of networks. And I think so often, as I said earlier on, we see networks just as this very amorphous, large, big bubble. But when you start breaking it down, you start seeing that there's a lot of variety. Now, what I'd like you to do, and I'll send you the slide deck afterwards, so you won't actually do it right now because we wouldn't have enough time. But I want you to try and write down, as of this moment, who are the people that sit in each of these hexagons. And then if you see that actually, you've got less than 5, apart from the negative one where you're obviously not trying to accrue big numbers, ask yourself what's going on there, how are you going to change that? Because you want to try and create more breadth in terms of each of these different hexagons. And then if you've got the same person in every single one of these hexagons, then you need to start appreciating that you also have a key person dependency risk, and that can be dangerous as well. So what happens if, for example, you have a falling out with a person, or the person leaves and you don't have access to them anymore, whatever it might be. So be careful that all of your networking centers around one person, because then that sets you up for failure. So ideally, sort of 5 as a minimum. I do this as well for myself, because as an external consultant, my bread and butter is my networks. Cold calling is a very difficult way to sell for business. It's all about the networks that you have. And there's an implied trust when a person has worked with you or knows you well. It's a very different dynamic when you are consulting into that sort of space as opposed to a cold call. So this, for me, has become a real reality and something that I've been working on for many years. And I say in most of the blogs, I'm sitting in sort of 15, 20 names, but I actively are kind of monitoring it and tracking it and trying to proactively build it and give into that network as well. Excuse me, sorry. Okay, so now depending on your driver, you need the right tools. So going back to why we network, we said that one of the reasons is we want to connect, and so then we need to understand, how do we build that compatibility? How do we figure out whether this is a person that we actually want to spend time with on a regular basis from a relationship perspective, etc. And I'm going to share with you a little tool. I'm going to go through it very quickly because it's very self-explanatory. You guys are smart, you'll get it. The second one, as we said, was around growth. And what we have to look at there is around how we collaborate. And it's funny, often we focus on other people in terms of their collaboration ability, but we need to look at, well, how good are we collaboratively? And what do we bring to the table that's going to foster this growth? Because often it's in the fusing of the ideas that we get the real sort of synergies, and we maybe not as collaborative as we actually think we are. So we need to improve that from our own capability perspective. The third one, as we said, was innovation, and David mentioned it right at the beginning. He talked about serendipity, and my point that I added to that idea was that if you've got specific constraints, challenges, issues that you are facing in your own life that you want to resolve, and you know what they are, it's funny how that serendipity starts really becoming realized, in the sense of you start noticing, oh, this person's writing about that, or that person's presenting at a conference or whatever. And then you can start making connections. But if you don't have that understanding of what those deep things are that you're solving for, it's very hard for that serendipity to manifest. And then the last one around power, was how do we influence up? And most of us typically have a boss, especially if we're inside an organization. And as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of people struggle, not because of the quality of their ideas, but because they don't actually have social capital or they don't know how to influence. And once you understand the science behind how to influence upwards, it's amazing what you can actually achieve over time. So as I said, I'll just briefly go through each of these. I'm more interested in getting to the conversation where we talk around creative ways of building our networks, and that's where we're going to break into small groups and discuss. But let me just quickly share with you how you could close some of these gaps. So in terms of, before we go there, key ingredients that you bring for a great day. So most of us at some stage in your lives have been a singleton, or maybe you still are, and there's certain things that kind of make a great date. And what would those be? So I'm just opening it up to everybody. So you see, I'm not just dealing with your work life, I'm also going to help you in your private life. What would be those ingredients that you need to bring for a great date? Let's hear. This is where everybody's going to be quiet.
Good food.
Good food, yes. It is amazing. It's just on that one. We know that when you want to get money from people, you always get them a really nice meal. So you'll notice that fundraising, they typically have really good food and then people will donate more. But good food is a good connector. Obviously, there's something about it that just brings people together. So good food is one of those. Yes, absolutely. What else?
I'm going to say room for communication. So having opportunity to talk with one another about things, getting to know each other and interests.
Yeah, absolutely. So the right time, the right place, where you can actually have a meaningful conversation. I mean, you could argue, I put up a picture there of Galileo at Kirstenbosch, watching a screen, you're not necessarily talking, but there's a before, there's an intermission, and there's an afterwards. And, the setting can have a very profound effect in terms of how people relate and relax, etc. Yeah, absolutely. What else?
Building on your earlier point, a desired outcome.
So understanding, what is it that you're wanting to get from that? And I always say, what you've got to try and think about is, well, how do I get to that second date? And that's, especially if you like the person, obviously that's the desired outcome, I would imagine. So there's that. What else?
I think showing up and being open to share.
Being open to share. And ideally, I agree with you. So, you can't be a closed book because then the conversation becomes very stilted and it's one way. And then the person says, why are you being so guarded? But I think most of us typically, well, not most of us, but many people will typically overtalk. It's about really listening to really understand where they're coming from, to be genuinely interested in the person. Because when you make a person feel special, they want to spend more time around you. So many people, it's an underlying human need, is we want to be valued, we want to be respected. And so very simple, whether it's a business interaction, whether it's a first date on a more romantic sort of level, just listen more, talk a little bit less, be genuinely interested. All of those things are going to add to creating a great date. And yes, we talked about venue, etc. So those are important things. But the reason why I bring this up as a metaphor, because I think it links back to networking as well. There are similarities between the two, with one caveat, and the stakes are not quite as high in terms of romantic relationships versus networking. If you don't hit it off with a person, don't worry, there are more people out there, and you can always grow that network. Romantically, sometimes we put ourselves into a bit of a corner and we get a bit flustered. But in the networking, the corporate setting, it's a slightly different, lower sort of stakes from that perspective. Now, if you're driven by connection, as I said, that's one of the reasons why we network, you have to try and find what are those common interests. Are we compatible? Would I want to spend time with that person? And it's quite nice to have a set of open-ended questions. Now, obviously, you're not going to take a piece of paper and then, be a parrot and paraphrase these to the individual, but just having a couple of these go-to questions that you can bring. And where the conversation goes, it's very open-ended. But what's on your mind? What do you like about your work? What are the interesting projects that you're working on? What's the highlight of your last year, etc., etc. And from there, you'll be amazed by what comes up. In terms of growth, and we talked about collaboration, and I mentioned the word collaboration index. Many of us think that we're very good collaborators, but when you start looking at these dimensions of collaboration, you might notice that there are a couple of these that you are not particularly good at. So, for example, where I'm really poor is the fourth from the bottom one, a need for immediate gratification. I'm a very action-oriented person, and so I like to get things done. And for me, especially when I was working in a team, I was the most experienced person both in years, but also in knowledge. And I didn't always take advantage of the great depth of creativity that my team members had, who were younger than I was and weren't psychologists. But I had an actuary that was reporting to me. I had a business science individual, and they were incredible. But one day I got cornered by one of them, and she just said, Mark, we just always just delivering. I just want to spend some time, I want to collaborate with you. And we broke away. We had a session for about 2 hours. And it was one of those sort of Damascus moments for me. And it was quite sad, if I'm being honest with you. I was about 40 at the time when this happened. I was going, jeepers. I just realized that I haven't leveraged my team at all. I haven't utilized all these brilliant skills. And then from that moment onwards, I did a real 180. And it's quite funny, that specific individual I'm talking about, I meet with her once a month. She's overseas now, she's emigrated, but we still collaborate and we interact with each other. But my big challenge was I was so action biased that I didn't always appreciate how to collaborate effectively. So I'm sure as you look through these, you might spot some of these that maybe resonate with you. And then when it comes to innovation, it's about knowing what are the things that are your constraints, and then from there being able to identify people in different forums that maybe have similar sort of constraints, and that you could have a shared interest around against which you could solve for. Now, don't get too hung up on what I've written in the sort of the pinky sort of blocks. Just look at the red blocks at the top, and there's essentially 3 sort of themes. So one is, what are your current important challenges that you have to resolve? So these are real issues for you. Then there's the middle section one, which is more about incremental change. It's irritating, but it's not so important. And then there's the kind of the blue sky thinking stuff. This would just change the whole game plan. And what are those? And every year, what I do is I refresh this list and I come up with new sets of lists. And it's amazing how just having this in the background, referring to it every couple of months, and then seeing who can help me with this, what you end up with, because that diversity of thought that Cheyenne was talking about earlier on is so powerful in solving the problems, avoiding groupthink, getting different perspectives, and also just energy, and making sometimes what feels very overwhelming tasks feel much more manageable because now you're collaborating with other people. And then the power one, which we said, if that's your driver, then how do you, so I'm just going to click this, should have hidden that earlier on. How do you manage upwards is realizing that there are 7 key things that you need to bear in mind if you are going to get that desired result. And when you apply most of these tactics, you have a 40% increased likelihood that you're going to get the ball across the line. Now, this is work that was done by Susan Ashford and James DeTrent. And in the speaker notes of these slides, it explains what goes behind each of these. But again, if you're struggling, if you're one of those people who has good ideas, but you don't seem to be able to get the traction, be honest with yourself, do a critical analysis, go through each of these and ask yourself, do I do this? Do I do this? See which ones you do and which ones you don't, and then start building in the ones that you typically don't do into your ability to influence upwards. All right, so what I wanted to do, and this is where I'd like to break us into smaller groups, is to think a little bit about how do we enhance our networks? How do we creatively grow our networks? What would be the practical things that we could do beyond LinkedIn and Facebook and Slack, and there are a lot of tech sort of things that we can do. But I think I want you to think quite creatively around how could we develop greater connection? How could we develop more growth opportunities or innovation or power? What would be those different little techniques or tactics, should I say, that we could use to close the gap in some of these? Because as I said earlier on, especially for men, 30%, we've got 30% less connections than what we used to have in terms of our social networks. So we need to be quite deliberate, quite clear about how we're going to do that. So let's, if we come out of this, break into small groups just for 5 minutes. And let me just have, so how many people have we got in? How many in total?
We've got 29 people, 28 now. I think some people.
Okay, so let me put, let's make it 8. Yeah, that's right. About 3 or 4 people per room. That's right. And create. And I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. If you can go in just for 5 minutes and just kind of brainstorm and share. How would you creatively enhance your networks? And then we'll come out and we'll share some ideas, and then we'll take it from there. Okay. All right. Okay. So it looks like we've got most people back. Let's hear some ideas. What were some of the things that you guys came up with in your groups around how you can creatively expand your networks?
All right. I can go first. With quite a mixed bag of ideas.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go with the wildest one. Baking
Okay.
baking cakes together. In case the people who are interested in pastries. Playing games. We spoke about that. Virtual book clubs, perhaps, if people are actually interested in books. And meetups like this one.
Okay, nice. Okay. So there was a mixture there. You said baking cakes. You didn't say whether it was cakes that were wacky weed cakes or normal cakes, but you just said cakes, things that you could do together, something collectively. That was fun. Okay, learning a skill. I like that. And then some more like on a virtual sort of setting, a little bit further away. Okay, using tech, which kind of makes sense, seeing this is a tech forum. Let's hear from the rest of the groups. What were the other things that you guys mentioned? Yes, David, go for it.
Yeah, I'll say we were quite reserved in our conversation. It didn't generate a lot of new things, but we spoke a bit about, so Ian spoke about showing interest in others' likes and work. So once you meet someone, how do you actually strengthen that link? As being really interested in that, and Tato built on that through the idea of how do you offer a helping hand to someone, because that he's found really works. And Ian is in a situation of being in a new company where he has to build his network there actively. So, and then from a bit left field, from my side, I was just sharing something I tried recently is I've written some crazy machine learning thing that counts my exercise reps because I was being lazy about it. And having a fun side project or a hobby as a talking point can often help to grow the network. So
nice. And then yeah, putting it out there into the universe and finding if there's other people who've got similar interests and things like that. Great. Super. Okay. Nice. What else, guys? What other things came up? Roberto, if I'm? Roberto, go
Yes. So my side was find nerdy things that like other software engineers may like doing, and then getting a part of those communities. So playing board games and things like that. I've grown my network quite a lot in these like very odd places, just doing the things that I usually enjoy doing.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's the key part of networking is it should be enjoyable. You should want to be spending time with somebody. And that definitely fits into that camp around connection and are we compatible? Do we have similar interests? Whatever it might be, whether it's nerdy or not nerdy, but what connects us from that perspective. All right. Okay. Let me just share with you, unless anybody's got anything else that they wanted to share, let me share with you a take on it. And, you know, obviously there's thousands of different ways to slice this cake. Sorry, I'm stuck on cakes now that person mentioned cakes, but let me just hide that. I'm just going to hide this top one over here. So I break this down into a sort of a 4-block model. It's a little bit clunky. I apologize. I was doing this today in terms of this model. But on the one side is, on the right-hand side is those activities that take higher effort. And then on the left-hand side, things that are a little bit easier. It's not a lot of heavy lifting. And then near proximity, meaning that you actually have to be in the person's presence. versus distance proximity, which is, obviously like over the network. Even here, where we've got, for example, a meetup that's electronic, we don't have to be physically in a person's presence. And using those as sort of the two axes, I kind of divided it up. I initially had the near proximity and the distant proximity as extroversion, introversion, but it didn't kind of work because I think I was being unfair to the extroverts and introverts in terms of that sort of differentiation. But if you come up with better ideas around how you would create this 4-block model, please tell me. Always want to refine my thinking and kind of grow what I'm kind of sharing with people. But as I said, this was designed today. So the first one is in the top right-hand corner, that requires near proximity, but and does take a bit of effort, is, for example, volunteering, finding charitable causes. I'm finding that on Instagram, I'm constantly clicking now on dogs. I've become besotted with dogs. And so I think I'm going to go and volunteer at the Wolf Project. But, I'll find other people that are mad about dogs and be able to network with them. Mentoring, coffee chats. Interestingly, mentoring as a way of networking. I mentioned it earlier on, this reverse mentoring can be a nice way. Conferences are the obvious ones, postgrad courses, hobby, sports clubs, think tanks. Tanaka, myself and Benny, we were all part of a think tank for a period of time together over a couple of years. And that was just a great opportunity for us to solve or try and work on a shared interest project, finding something of common interest. Themed dinners, games nights, Roberto, you mentioned doing something nerdy, games, etc., creating those. All of those do take a bit of effort because you've got to get the people together. Cape Towners are not typically always the most social sometimes, and it does require you to be in close proximity. Then distant proximity, so you don't have to be in a person's space, but does take effort, is being a thought leader, writing articles. I think earlier on, David, you mentioned a serendipity article that you had written. That's a classic example of where then other people can be interested in a topic, they start connecting with you because they like your thinking. Podcasts, etc. I think you do podcasts. Genship collaboration. I don't have to talk to you guys about GitHub, Stack Overflow, ResearchGate, AngelList, all of these opportunities where we can create and collaborate together in a virtual sort of space, continuous professional development, MOOCs, massive open online courses. All of those are ways of building our networks. Then in the bottom left-hand corner, so low effort, distant proximity, the classic ones, the normal suspects, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. Networking apps like Meetup, Shaper, Bumble, communities, which I'm sure many of you are part of. And then, ironically, just reposting articles and having shout-outs. When you've seen some piece of work that people really like, people love praise, and it's amazing. I did this with somebody at Wharton Business School. I really liked her work, and I put a shout out there, and she picked it up on a feed, and kind of we started connecting and talking. Just a nice positive gossip. It's a nice way to build some of your network. And then in the top left-hand side, so still low effort, but near does require proximity, rideshare on Uber for those of you that are more extroverted, coffee shop lounging, co-working spaces, professional alumni groups, all connections, local tour events, concerts, etc. Now, as you can see, there's lots of different options, and this is not exhaustive, obviously. But what I kind of challenge most of you to do is to try and pick one out of each of the different blocks where possible and start just investing over a period of time on that, just to take yourself a little bit out of your comfort zone. You'll be pleasantly surprised by what potentially can transpire. Now, my last parting comment, because I'm aware that we are kind of going to be out of time now, is this idea around your network is your net worth. And to my mind, there are three things that you must remember if you are trying to increase this net worth component of your life. Is be deliberate. So, what are you trying to achieve? And go back to the 4 reasons why we network. Be disciplined. This does take time. And, if you're trying to ask people for favors or foot ups, etc., but you've never invested in the relationship in the first place, it's probably a bad starting point for you in terms of from that conversation. So be disciplined, put that effort in on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, and then be generous. There is that element of karma, and you'll be incredibly surprised by how things come back to you in positive ways when you are generous to other people and you help them and give them foot ups, etc. So that's my parting comments on your network is your net worth. Oh, are there any questions?
There was one on Slido, so I think we can quickly take it.
Okay.
So this was from David. The question was, there's actually two, so another one just popped in, but let's go with David's one. First, you mentioned a network of 15 to 20 per hex cell. I think that was from that earlier model. But guessing this varies based on life work stage. How do you see this evolve?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was my numbers. So I'm not saying that's what you should be aiming for. I think a reasonable sort of number would be around 5. And it is very much life stage. So if you're a newbie in an organization, you're 24, 25, you're not going to have a lot of those connections. And it actually also becomes even more dire, typically when we start talking about previously disadvantaged people who don't have those networks. But the interesting point there is that doesn't mean that it's not important. It actually becomes even more important for them to understand the power of network and then to be able to try and help them build those networks, because otherwise they will always be running a very different race. And so it's quite interesting. I do a lot of presenting on those hexagons to youngsters especially, so people 24 to 30 years old. And there's a lot of consensus amongst them that they appreciate that this is their reality and they need to work on it. So, yeah, so David, it wasn't that you should be aiming for 15-20, that I have to have 15-20 because my business model depends on it, unless I go hardcore marketing and cold calling and things like that, which I don't want to do. I much prefer kind of relational kind of business model for myself. Okay. The second question, sorry, Charles, what was the second question that needs to answer?
The second question is, how do you build networks when people just don't want to network? We arrange monthly online socials, but hardly anyone attends them.
Yeah, so then you got to ask yourself, almost like the 4 Ps of marketing. It's like the product, positioning, the price, all of those sorts of things. Are you giving them things that actually they enjoy doing? I think one of the persons said, well, bake cakes. If you don't eat cakes and you're a cyclist and you're trying to keep your body weight down, nobody's going to come to that session. But if you happen to like baking cakes, then you're going to find an audience. So I think you've got to give people what they want, and that's why there's 4 blocks that I shared at the end in terms of proximal versus near low effort versus high effort, is try and see what sort of smorgasbord of offerings you can provide and what has organically has an uptake from that perspective. That makes sense. You can't be a one-trick pony though. You can't just expect people are going to pitch for something that they're not interested in.
All right.
Yes, Ewan. So Ewan's got his hand up.
So, yeah, my question is going to add on to that a bit. So we very much a remote team, and we're 4 contracting houses working on the same project. So we're not even one company. Mm-hmm. And this is the latest thing we're trying. We've tried a few things, but it's always the same 5-6 people that pitch up every time. It's like nobody wants to try do anything to see what works.
Mm.
So that's where it's coming from.
Yeah. Sure. Shame. I can hear your distress there. One of the interesting things about virtual teams and what the research has indicated is that for all successful virtual teams, there has to be at some stage a time where they spend time face to face, where they're actually together. Now, you could say, well, look, hold on, look, we're sitting in India, South Africa, South America, etc. But the ones that really perform, and I suppose there are problems around budget constraints, flights, etc. But if you're going to have a long-term project where you're going to depend on each other over a long period of time, you actually have to get people together. Nothing beats people face-to-face in the same sort of environment. And that's one of the sort of the golden threads, because trust, all of those things, body language, connection, there's a lot to be said for that face-to-face time. And then you can do some fun activities. You can get them to generate. You ask every single one of them and then try and see if there's commonalities around that, as opposed to pushing ideas at them, get them to generate some of those ideas. You build something that's meaningful from that perspective. But I realize that piece of advice has limitations because maybe you don't have the budget to be able to do that. But from the research articles I've read, they've always said at some stage you have to get those guys together to build those relationships. Any other questions?
I have two questions. So the first one is, how does Dunbar's numbers sort of come into place here? Because like you're constantly trying to expand your network and grow that, but at some point you're going to have certain connections like fall away. And how do you manage that? I guess tapering into that, the next question is, how much effort should you put into like enriching your network and going deep in the connections, and then how much should be spent on like extending it? Because I made a mistake early on, and then like doing too much of the enriching, and there was a certain point at which a lot of my network moved overseas, and then I had to struggle to like sort of rebuild a stronger network again.
Yeah. So Dunbar's number is that you've got about 150 connections that are close, and then beyond that, you can't really kind of maintain those sorts of relationships. And I know, Roberta, you've got young children. Probably find that your network has got smaller because you're just focusing on your children. But that number of 150 is often quoted. It really does talk to. I think it is about an and, not an or. So you're asking this breadth versus depth sort of scenario, and you kind of made the point for why there's a reason to have breadth, because if you have key man or key person dependencies and they leave, or you have a falling out or whatever, and you've only got one person in your network, then you're going to be in trouble. The problem, though, is if you're trying to have 50 people and making deep connections, you don't have the amount of time to do that. So it's somewhere in between. That's why I said I think 5 is fine, and there were 6 hexagons there, so we're talking about 30. You figure out what works for you. But typically, what I find is most people are seriously undercooked. It's not about having too many. It's actually most people, if we did a survey now, would be sitting at a much lower number. Benny's an arch networker. I mean, it's part of his business model as well, but he does it incredibly well. So he's probably got very high numbers. But for many of us, we wouldn't be putting that level of effort in from that perspective. Okay. Cool. Any other questions?
Practical question, Mark. What do you actually do to remind yourself of the network and how you're maintaining it?
So I have once a year I do that audit, so that reality check, because there's nothing as sobering as realizing that you've got lots of blank spaces and things like that. I do go onto my phone though, because we often also forget how many networks we really got, and I just check against that. So I use that as a reference point from that perspective, and then I also have reminders in my Outlook. And kind of saying, well, have you contacted these people? And ironically, the network that I sometimes forget the most is my balanced one, it's my friends. And so I've identified some key friends that I really mustn't kind of drop. And I just say, have I seen them in the last month? If not, and then I'll go and interact with them and make that. So I automate some of it, because David, it's very easy to get caught up in the busyness of life. And then before you know it, 6 months down the line, and kind of you've lost track of it. Okay. Cool. Anything else? Any other questions? Not to Knox, that looks like it.
All right. Thank you so much for addressing the questions, Mark. And also thank you for another great talk. Always appreciate that your talks are not only good knowledge on the theory side, but also a lot of key practical takeaways on how to actually achieve what you're trying to teach us. Yeah. So thanks again for coming to Take Leadership, and the door's always open. If you want to do another one, you're always welcome. And as is customary from Take Leadership, we give out a book to the speaker just as a token of appreciation. So Benny will probably be in touch with you. That book is sponsored by Matchbox Solutions, Benny's company. So yeah, you can let us know what you're interested in reading and we'll get that book to you.
Awesome, lovely. Thank you so much. It was very unexpected and very unnecessary, but thank you for the opportunity. And it was lovely seeing so many faces that I recognize. So lovely to see all of you guys. Keep well.
Cool. Yeah, thank you to everyone. If you're in Cape Town, the next one is in person and we'll be likely at the Take a Lot offices. So, but we'll send out the usual invites and everything. But thank you everyone and have a good evening.